Imagine a single log burning in a settler's cabin, the last barrier between a family and the killing frost. Outside, the forests are silent, the rivers frozen, and the fields buried beneath snow. Inside, hunger gnaws, illness spreads, and every ember becomes a matter of life and death. For the first settlers in America, winter was not just a season, it was a sentence. Each day demanded choices: which mouth to feed, which resource to spare, and which hope to cling to. This is the story of survival when the firewood ran out. When the first English settlers set foot on the rocky shores of New England, they were not simply encountering new land. They were stepping into a climate that would test them in ways few had imagined. The early months of arrival often coincided with the onset of autumn, a season they welcomed as familiar. But what lay ahead, the long descent into winter, carried a weight far beyond their expectations. The moment the first frost came, settlers began to understand that this new world demanded more than courage. It demanded a confrontation with nature at its most unforgiving. In England, winters were damp, chilly, and uncomfortable, but rarely fatal for those who had shelter and food. The Gulf Stream tempered Europe's cold, softening its edges. In New England, however, the winters were sharper, harsher, and longer. Temperatures dropped lower, snow fell deeper, and the frost lingered far past what they knew. Accounts from the Plymouth colony, founded in 1620, reveal shock at the severity of the first cold months. Bradford's A Plymouth Plantation describes a great sickness that swept through the community, intensified by exposure and malnutrition. What began as a brisk autumn soon hardened into a season of despair. The first frost marked a turning point. Settlers watched as the green fields they hoped to cultivate withered under ice. Gardens that had been hastily planted upon arrival yielded little before the freeze. Maize, gifted and taught by indigenous neighbors, became invaluable, for it was already suited to the climate. Still, many colonists lacked the time or knowledge to harvest enough before the frost came. Hunting, too, grew harder as animals retreated or grew scarce in the frozen woods. With rivers and streams icing over, even fishing, a lifeline for coastal colonies, became more difficult. The frost signaled not only cold nights, but the narrowing of every possible food source. Shelter provided little relief. Many early settlers constructed crude houses or leaned on temporary shelters, often unfinished when winter descended. Gaps in walls allowed icy winds to cut through, while roofs leaked snowmelt. At Plymouth, some colonists still lived in makeshift huts or aboard the Mayflower during their first winter. That decision, though providing shelter from snow, exposed them to cramped and unsanitary conditions that spread disease. Frost clung to wooden walls, floors stiffened with ice, and fires barely kept pace with the relentless chill. For men, women, and children who had left stone cottages in England, the realization set in: their homes here were fragile barriers, not fortresses. The psychological weight of the first frost was immense. Settlers recorded the silence that fell over the landscape as snow blanketed fields and forests. The cheerful bustle of summer gave way to stillness broken only by the wind. Days shortened, and the absence of sunlight deepened despair. Darkness fell early, extending the hours when families huddled around small fires, waiting for morning. For colonists who had left familiar towns and villages, this sense of isolation, amplified by the climate, reinforced the feeling of exile in a world that seemed intent on testing their resolve. The mortality of that first frost was staggering. In the winter of 1609 to 1610 at Jamestown, later called the Starving Time, cold compounded with food shortages to claim the lives of more than three-quarters of the colonists. At Plymouth, during the winter of 1620 to 1621, nearly half of the settlers perished, many from scurvy, pneumonia, and other illnesses worsened by cold and hunger. The frost was not just a backdrop. It was an active killer, tightening its grip on weakened bodies. Graves were dug in frozen ground with immense effort, sometimes disguised to prevent local tribes from seeing how depleted the colony had become. The contrast between settlers and indigenous peoples during these first frosts was stark. For the Wampanoag, Narragansett, and other tribes in New England, the frost was expected part of the natural cycle of life. They had stores of dried corn, beans, and fish carefully prepared for the season. Their homes, built from bark, hides, and mats, were insulated and efficient. They wore furs adapted to climate, traveled on snowshoes, and hunted game that settlers could not reach. For colonists unfamiliar with such practices, survival required humility, a willingness to learn from those who had thrived in these winters for centuries. In time, many did, but during the first frost, arrogance and ignorance often cost lives. Religious interpretations of the frost deepened its significance. Ministers preached that the cold was both trial and judgment. To many Puritans, winter was a test of faith, a proving ground where only the truly devoted could endure. The frost, then, was not only environmental but spiritual. Survival was framed as divine favor, while death was seen as part of God's inscrutable will. This lens gave meaning to suffering, but also intensified the psychological burden, as individuals searched their souls for hidden sins that might explain their suffering. The frost reshaped social structures. Communities that had arrived fractured by ambition or difference often found themselves united by necessity. Firewood had to be gathered, meals shared, and sick tended. The cold did not discriminate by class, and survival demanded cooperation. Yet the frost also revealed inequalities. Those with greater supplies, stronger houses, or better connections survived more comfortably, while the poor bore the brunt of hunger and exposure. Diaries and letters show resentment growing in some colonies, where hoarding or withholding supplies during frostbitten months created bitterness that outlasted winter. Above all, the first frost forced recognition of a simple truth. Survival here was not guaranteed. The dream of prosperity, of fertile land and freedom, was confronted by a reality of fragility. For many, the frost stripped away illusions and revealed the sheer scale of the task before them. To endure in New England, winter demanded preparation, adaptation, and resilience far beyond what most had known in their homelands. By spring, those who had endured carried scars both visible and invisible. They had buried neighbors, spouses, and children. They had dismantled furniture for firewood, rationed meals to near starvation, and prayed for daylight through endless nights. The memory of the first frost remained, retold in sermons and stories as a lesson for future generations. Winter would always come, and its arrival would always be feared. But those who endured learned to prepare, to adapt, and to respect the land that had nearly consumed them. The frost in that first season was more than a change of weather. It was a moment when settlers realized a new world was not theirs to command, but a force to be survived. When English settlers arrived on the shores of New England in the early 1600s, their survival hinged on the speed and quality of the shelters they could build. The image of a log cabin, snug against the cold, has become part of American folklore, yet the reality was far bleaker. The first cabins were not comfortable havens, but hastily built defenses against a climate far harsher than what most settlers had ever known. The winter winds in New England exposed every weakness in construction, every gap between logs, and every shortage of timber. The settlers' understanding of housing was shaped by Europe. Many came from stone cottages or timber-framed houses, built with centuries of knowledge suited to England's damp but relatively moderate winters. What they found in America demanded adaptation, but time was not on their side. Most arrived late in the year, after precious weeks for building and planting had already passed. Cabins were often incomplete when the first snows fell. Many settlers at Plymouth in 1620 spent their first winter, not in proper houses, but on the Mayflower itself, anchored offshore. There, cramped quarters, damp air, and poor sanitation bred sickness, claiming dozens of lives. For those who managed to erect cabins, the structures varied in design and quality. Typically, early cabins were built of rough-hewn logs stacked horizontally, their ends notched to lock together. Spaces between the logs were chinked with mud, clay, straw, or moss, but these makeshift sealants often failed under freezing temperatures. Cold air seeped in, winds howled through cracks, and snow sometimes drifted inside. Roofs were steep and covered with wooden shingles or thatch, materials that could not always withstand heavy snowfall. In some cases, roofs collapsed under the weight of accumulated ice and snow, forcing families to rebuild in midwinter. Inside, the cabin offered little comfort. Floors were packed earth, often damp and freezing. A single fireplace, constructed of stone or clay, served as the only source of heat and light. The fire provided warmth directly in front of the hearth, but corners of the room remained icy. Families slept in close proximity, often on straw pallets or wooden planks, huddled together for warmth. The air grew thick with smoke, especially if chimneys were poorly built. Accounts describe settlers' eyes watering, lungs burning, and ceilings blackened by soot. Yet without the fire, frost crept in from the walls and floors, freezing water buckets left overnight. The lack of insulation was a constant danger. Blankets were scarce, and wool or linen bedding brought from Europe quickly wore thin. Animal furs, if available, were precious, but hunting was not always successful. Many settlers slept in their clothes, layering garments day and night. Shoes stiffened with frost, making mornings painful. Children, the elderly, and the sick suffered the most, their bodies unable to withstand the constant exposure. Diaries and letters record the agony of frostbite, the swelling and blackening of fingers and toes, and the long nights punctuated by coughs and wheezing. In wealthier or better prepared settlements, cabins sometimes improved with time. Clapboard siding was added to log structures, providing a tighter barrier. Chimneys were rebuilt of brick or stone, reducing smoke and improving efficiency. Windows, when available, were small, covered with oil paper or animal hide to admit light, while keeping out drafts. Still, such improvements were gradual, often taking years. For the first winters, most families endured conditions far below what they had expected when they embarked across the Atlantic. The cold cabins were not just physical spaces, but psychological battlegrounds. The walls pressed in with silence, amplifying the sense of isolation. Families could not venture far during storms, and entire days passed in dim, smoky rooms. The endless sound of wind became a torment, a reminder of the thin line between survival and exposure. The cabin was supposed to protect, yet settlers often described feeling as if nature invaded at will, slipping through every crack. The claustrophobia, combined with hunger and illness, deepened despair. The inadequacy of these cabins was starkly highlighted in times of crisis. During the starving time at Jamestown in 1609 to 1610, colonists not only endured famine, but also shivered in poorly constructed shelters. Reports describe men and women burning their furniture and wooden tools just to keep fires alive. In Plymouth, settlers dismantled sections of cabins for fuel, sacrificing long-term shelter for immediate warmth. Such acts underscored the fragility of their situation. Survival demanded destruction of the very structures meant to save them. Contrast again came from indigenous peoples of New England. The Wampanoag, Narragansett, and others lived in Wheatus, dome-shaped dwellings constructed wooden frames covered with bark, reeds, or mats. These homes were not only quicker to build, but better suited to insulation. The material could be replaced as needed, and their design kept warmth inside while allowing smoke to escape. Observing these methods gradually influenced colonists, some of whom adopted or adapted aspects of indigenous housing. But the first winters had already shown how ill-prepared European designs were for New England's environment. Over time, cabins became symbols of perseverance. What began as crude shelters evolved into sturdier homes, and later generations romanticized them as icons of frontier resilience. Yet the truth remembered in early records is far bleaker. For the first settlers, cabins were sites of suffering, where families endured nights of cold so intense that survival itself was uncertain. The cabins of cold were not yet the proud log houses of frontier mythology, but desperate bulwarks against an overwhelming climate. By spring, many cabins stood empty, their occupants claimed by disease, hunger, or frost. Survivors repaired and improved them, learning from failure. The memory of those first winters lingered, shaping colonial practices for decades. More than just homes, these structures became lessons in preparation, adaptation, and the cost of underestimating the land. The cabins bore witness to the fragility of human ambition when set against the brutal force of New England's winter. When the frost set in and the first storms covered New England in snow, settlers discovered that survival depended not only on shelter and fire, but on the food they had managed to store. For many, this was where hope faltered. The hearth, intended as a center of warmth and nourishment, became a place of anxiety and despair. Each meal was measured, each crumb rationed, and each day stretched thinner than the last. Hunger was not a distant threat. It lived inside the cabin, gnawing at families night after night. Food scarcity had roots in the timing of colonial arrivals. Ships often reached New England late in the year. Sometimes as autumn gave way to winter, colonists had little time to plant, harvest, or prepare stores before the ground froze. At Plymouth, where the Mayflower arrived in December 1620, settlers had virtually no crops of their own. They depended on supplies brought from England, salted meats, ship's biscuits, dried peas, but these were quickly consumed or spoiled in the damp climate. Rats and insects claimed their share. The settlers soon learned that what had sustained them at sea could not last through a New England winter. For those who managed to plant, yields were meager. European grains such as wheat and barley struggled in the rocky soil and short growing season. Settlers had not yet mastered the cultivation of maize, which Native Americans had grown successfully for centuries. In their first winters, they relied heavily on what indigenous neighbors could trade or spare. Without cornmeal, many colonists faced outright starvation. By spring, hunger had reduced bodies to weakness, and a lack of fresh food produced scurvy, swelling joints, and bleeding gums. The daily diet in winter was monotonous and meager. Families boiled thin porridges from what grains they had, stretched stews with scraps of vegetables, and relied on salted fish or pork when available. Over time, these rations dwindled. Diaries record days when meals consisted of little more than broth flavored with bones already used several times. In Jamestown, George Percy described the infamous starving time of 1609 to 1610, when desperate colonists ate horses, dogs, cats, rats, and even boiled leather to survive. While New England settlers rarely descended to such extremes, the underlying hunger was no less real. Inside the cabin, the hearth was both savior and torment. Fires cooked what little food existed, but the sight of pots simmering within gruel offered scant comfort. Children cried with hunger, and adults weakened. The smell of burning would often outweigh the aroma of meals, a cruel reminder that there was more fuel for fire than food for stomachs. Each family measured its stores with precision, counting ears of corn, weighing salted meat, and rationing flour. To miscalculate meant disaster. Some chose to skip meals, eating once a day to prolong survival. Others bartered precious tools or clothing for food. Hunger reshaped relationships within and between families. The wealthy or better prepared sometimes had more, but their surplus became a source of tension. In several colonies, accusations of hoarding or theft arose during harsh winters. Records mention punishments for stealing corn or poaching from shared stores. Trust eroded as food ran low, and hunger tested the ideals of community and faith. Sermons reminded colonists of biblical trials, urging them to endure with patience. But the growl of empty stomachs often outweighed piety. For indigenous peoples, winter hunger was a challenge as well, but centuries of adaptation provided tools for survival. They dried fish, smoked venison, stored nuts and berries, and knew how to forage even in snow-covered forests. Some shared these techniques with settlers, teaching them to plant maize with fish fertilizer, to preserve beans, and to hunt game in winter. Yet relationships were fragile, and food scarcity sometimes strained alliances. When English settlers raided native food stores or demanded supplies, conflict erupted. Hunger, in this way, fueled not only individual suffering, but broader tensions that shaped colonial history. Psychologically, hunger magnified the weight of winter. The body weakened, energy waned, and illness spread more easily among the malnourished. Coughs deepened into pneumonia, small wounds festered, and fevers raged. Mothers struggled to feed children, sometimes chewing hard corn to soften it for infants. The elderly, often least able to endure, succumbed quickly. Graves multiplied, dug in frozen ground, while survivors pressed on with hollow eyes and gaunt faces. The first winters left a legacy of lessons. Colonists gradually learned the importance of preparation, planting enough maize, drying fish, salting meat, and storing roots. Communal storage houses became more common, as did regulations on rationing. Yet these practices arose only after the devastating losses of those first frosts. Hunger had to carve its scars into memory before systems of resilience emerged. In the end, hunger at the hearth was more than a description of empty pots. It was a lived reality of settlers whose dreams of prosperity collided with the brutal mathematics of survival. Every family faced the question of how long their stores would last, how many meals they could endure without, and whether spring would arrive before hunger consumed them. The hearth, the center of home, became a reminder not of abundance, but a thin line between life and death in the New World. In the bitter winters of early New England, survival often hinged not on coins or trade goods, but on the simple presence which stacked beside the hearth. Firewood was the lifeblood of every settlement. Without it, cabins froze, food went uncooked, and illness thrived. With it, families had a fragile shield against a relentless cold. For settlers who crossed the Atlantic in search of freedom or fortune, the reality was stark. In winter, the true currency was not gold, but the logs that crackled in their fires. The forests of New England seemed, at first glance, inexhaustible. Towering oaks, maples, and pines spread across the land in abundance. English settlers marveled at the sheer scale of the woods, which dwarfed the managed landscapes of Europe. Yet abundance did not mean accessibility. Felling trees with hand tools was grueling work, made harder by frozen ground, snowdrifts, and the weakness that came from hunger. Axes dulled quickly, saws broke, and hauling heavy logs through knee-deep snow drained what little energy remained. The seemingly endless forest became a daily battle of labor and endurance. A single household could burn through immense quantities of wood during the winter. A small cabin required at least 4 to 6 cords, piles of cut with each measuring 4 feet high, 4 feet wide, and 8 feet long, just to maintain a constant fire. Larger homes consumed even more. Settlers who failed to prepare enough found themselves in dire straits by midwinter, burning furniture, fences, and even sections of their cabins to stay warm. William Bradford's accounts from Plymouth describe nights when fires barely held against the cold and the woodpile dwindled to nothing. Because of this, firewood became a commodity as valuable as food. Neighbors traded logs for cornmeal, salted fish, or woolen clothing. Communities sometimes organized shared woodcutting days, yet disputes over access to timber often arose. In towns where settlements spread quickly, nearby forests were stripped bare within a generation, forcing colonists to travel farther each year to haul wood back. The labor of cutting and carrying fell heavily on men and older boys. though in times of desperation, women and children joined the task. Splitting logs became not only work, but a measure of survival. For the poor, the struggle was even harsher. Those without enough able-bodied labor in their households could not gather the necessary wood, leaving them vulnerable to the cold. Some relied on charity, while others bartered away tools, clothing, or future labor just to obtain a few more logs. Winter exposed inequalities, as wealthier families with large stores would endure with relative comfort, while the poor suffered. Colonial records mention fines of those caught stealing wood, a crime that in desperate times carried the weight of survival itself. The scarcity of firewood was compounded by the inefficiency of early fireplaces. Massive stone hearths radiated some heat, but most warmth escaped up the chimney. Cabins often remained freezing, except for the small circle directly before the fire. As a result, fires had to burn constantly, day and night, consuming wood at a relentless pace. Falling asleep as a fire burned out risked waking defrost coating the inside walls, water buckets frozen solid, and even death from exposure. Settlers learned quickly that what was more than fuel, it was life itself. Indigenous peoples had long managed forests with fire, clearing underbrush and encouraging regrowth, ensuring steady supplies of wood for their needs. Their seasonal movements also reduced the strain on any single location. Settlers tied to fixed plots of land and unaccustomed to such practices consumed nearby timber at alarming rates. Over time, this led to deforestation near growing towns and forced colonists into new patterns of labor and land management. Firewood shortages, even in forest-rich regions, became part of colonial life. The psychological weight of the woodpile was constant. Families measured it daily, counting the logs, calculating how many nights it might last. Each trip to the woodshed or stack outside carried both relief and dread. Relief that some fuel remained, dread that the pile shrank faster than the winter eased. Stories circulated of winters when snowstorms trapped families inside for days, forcing them to ration every log, burning smaller and smaller fires until rescue or thaw. Over time, firewood shaped not only survival but the rhythms of colonial society. Cutting wood became a seasonal ritual, a communal necessity that tied neighbors together. Town records from Massachusetts and Connecticut detail ordinances regulating wood gathering, protecting access to common forests, and punishing theft. Firewood even became part of wages, with laborers sometimes paid in cords of wood instead of coin. Ministers, school teachers, and town officials often received part of their salary as guaranteed with deliveries from local families, recognizing that status and survival alike depended on warmth. The symbolism of firewood ran deep. In sermons, ministers drew parallels between the flame that kept families alive and the fire of faith that sustained the soul. The dwindling of the woodpile was likened to the testing of belief, a reminder that survival came not only from labor, but from divine providence. Yet symbolism did not soften the hard truth. Without wood, life in a New England winter was brutally short. By spring, when snow melted and forests opened again, survivors reflected on the months spent guarding their fires. The memory of empty woodpiles, the sight of cabins with walls dismantled for fuel, and the sound of axes in frozen air became etched into colonial memory. Firewood was not simple material. It was a measure of endurance, the currency of winter, and the thin line that kept settlers alive when all else failed. For the children of early New England settlements, winter was not only a season of hardship, but a test of survival that marked their entire upbringing. While adults bore the burden of cutting wood, rationing food, and maintaining fragile shelters, children lived the cold in ways that were both physical and deeply psychological. Their smaller bodies, fragile health, and limited strength made them the most vulnerable. In many families, the fate of the young was the most painful measure of how brutal the winter had become. Mortality records from Plymouth and other early colonies reveal how devastating winters were for children. In the first winter of Plymouth, Nearly half of the Mayflower passengers died. Among them were many children whose immune systems were weakened by hunger, scurvy, and exposure. Cold cabins, smoky fires, and the spread of illness created an environment in which even minor sicknesses could prove fatal. Diaries describe infants shivering through the night, wrapped in blankets that did little against the frost, their cries fading into silence. For settlers who had dreamed of establishing families in the New World, the loss of children was an ever-present grief. Those who survived carried the burden of labor from an early age. By necessity, children became part of the fight against winter. Boys joined their fathers and older brothers in gathering kindling, carrying wood, or breaking ice at frozen rivers for water. Girls helped their mothers tend fires, prepare what little food was available, and patch clothes worn thin by constant use. In times of desperation, children scoured the frozen ground for roots, nuts, or anything edible. Their labor did not match that of adults, but every effort mattered when survival balanced on a knife's edge. Hunger weighed heavily on children. Their smaller bodies succumbed quickly to malnutrition, and their cries for food were among the most haunting sounds of winter. Parents rationed carefully, sometimes giving children slightly larger shares, but there was rarely enough. In accounts from Jamestown and later settlements, descriptions of children's frailty are repeated with sorrow. Hollow cheeks, swollen bellies from starvation, and listless movements became common sights. Illness followed hunger, and childhood diseases like measles or influenza spread rapidly in crowded cabins, often claiming multiple children in a single household. Frostbite was another ever-present danger. Children sent to fetch water, collect wood, or tend to animals risked exposure to bitter winds. Fingers, toes, and ears froze quickly, and without knowledge of treatment, permanent damage was common. Diaries note children crying as their skin blistered or turned black from frostbite. Some recovered, but others lost mobility or even their lives. In this way, winter robbed not only of nourishment but of physical wholeness, leaving lasting scars on survivors. Education, a value cherished by many Puritan settlers, also faltered in winter. Harsh conditions forced schools to close, as cabins could not be heated well enough for study. Children learned instead through daily survival tasks. They absorbed lessons on resilience, endurance, and the harsh realities of life in New England. Ministers often emphasized that children's suffering mirrored biblical trials, instilling the belief that survival itself was a form of divine education. Yet the lived experience was harsher than any sermon. It was the sound of wind shaking cabin walls, the feel of hunger in the stomach, and the sight of frost on the inside of blankets. The emotional toll on parents was profound. Mothers recorded the agony of watching children fade from illness or hunger. Fathers, tasked with providing, endured guilt when woodpiles ran low or game could not be hunted. Ministers reminded families that children were lent by God, and their deaths were part of divine will, but grief cut deep. Families that buried children in frozen ground carried scars that shaped their faith, resilience, and memory of winter for years to come. Not all was despair, however. Some accounts speak of children adapting in ways adults could not. They learned to play in snow, to laugh even amid hunger, to find moments of distraction. Their resilience, though often fleeting, gave hope to parents and communities. Survival of children through a brutal winter symbolized endurance, the possibility of a future despite overwhelming odds. Indigenous children, meanwhile, faced winters differently. Raised within cultures that had mastered survival in the climate, they grew up learning to use snowshoes, to hunt small game, and to prepare preserved foods. Their homes were warmer, their diets more reliable, and their health less fragile. For English settlers, this contrast was stark. Indigenous survival strategies became not only lessons but lifelines, as some colonists adopted their methods to protect their own children. By spring, the toll of winter on children was always visible. Graves stood in rows near settlements, many marked with the names of the young. Survivors bore thin frames and pale faces, but they also carried a hardening that winter enforced. Childhood in New England was short, shaped not by play but by endurance. To be a child in the cold was to grow quickly into realities of survival, to learn early that life in this new land was fragile, and to embody the resilience that would define generations of settlers. The memory of children's suffering lingered long in colonial communities. It shaped laws about food storage, firewood, and communal responsibility. It influenced sermons that emphasized care for the weak and vulnerable. And it remained in family stories, passed down as reminders of the cost of neglecting preparation. Winter had taught them that survival was not an individual matter, but a collective one, and that the cries of children in the cold were warnings etched into memory. When winter descended on New England, the vast forest that seemed so alive in summer fell into a silence that startled the first settlers. To those who arrived expecting abundance in every season, the transformation was shocking. The great woods, filled in warmer months with bird song, the rustle of deer and the chatter of small animals, grew still beneath a blanket of snow. For colonists, the forest in winter was no longer a source of sustenance, but a place of scarcity and fear, where survival hung on each attempt to wrest food or fuel from the frozen wilderness. The silence of the forest was both physical and psychological. In the early mornings, when settlers ventured from their cabins, the world was muffled by snow. Footsteps crunched on frozen ground, but the familiar signs of life were absent. Rivers that had teemed with fish were locked beneath ice. Trees stood bare, their branches creaking in the wind. Game animals, once plentiful, had retreated to deeper woods or gone to ground. The abundant settlers had glimpsed in autumn now seemed like an illusion, replaced by a desolate emptiness that mirrored their own hunger. Hunting, once a hopeful pursuit, became a desperate struggle. Colonists brought European expectations to the New World, imagining that forests filled with deer, turkey, and rabbits would provide food throughout the year. But in winter, animals were harder to track and scarcer near settlements. Snow-covered trails, and settlers lacked the indigenous knowledge of how to read subtle signs in the frozen landscape. Firearms, still cumbersome and unreliable, made successful hunts rare. Ammunition was limited, and wasting powder on failed shots could mean starvation later. Accounts describe days when hunters returned empty-handed, their breath heavy with frost, their families waiting in disappointment. Fishing, too, dwindled as streams froze. Ice had to be broken with axes, and lines dropped into freezing water yielded little. The coast offered some relief, as ocean waters did not freeze, but storms and rough seas made fishing dangerous in winter months. For inland settlements, fish became scarce, and the reliance on preserved stores deepened. The forest, once imagined as a bounty, now withheld its gifts. Indigenous peoples had long understood the rhythms of the forest and adapted to its cycles. They hunted selectively, storing dried venison, smoked fish, and nuts in preparation for the silent months. Snowshoes allowed them to move across deep drifts with efficiency, while settlers floundered waist-deep in snow, exhausting themselves in futile hunts. Native knowledge of winter tracking, reading faint prints, noticing bent twigs, or following subtle trails, allowed them to find game where settlers saw nothing. Over time, colonists learned from these practices, but in their first winters, ignorance cost them dearly. The silence of the forest was not only about scarcity of food, it was also about isolation. In summer, the woods had been a place of movement and gathering, where settlers foraged, cut timber, and explored. In winter, the forest became forbidding. Snowdrifts blocked paths, and storms made travel dangerous. Cabins clustered close to one another became small islands, with the forest as a dark sea between them. Venturing too far risked becoming lost, frostbitten, or attacked by predators driven closer to settlements in search of food. Wolves, in particular, prowled near villages, their howls breaking the otherwise eerie silence of the winter woods. Fuel as vital as food came only from the forest. Settlers needed constant supplies of wood, but felling trees in the snow was brutal labor. Trees frozen hard as stone resisted axes, and hauling logs through snow drained men of energy they could scarcely spare. Frostbite and exhaustion took their toll, and yet the forest demanded to be worked. The silence was deceptive. Behind it lay endless labor. Each log cut a battle against both nature and time. Psychologically, the silence of forest deepened despair. Long nights in cabins were punctuated by the absence of sound outside. Settlers described the endless howling of wind, the occasional crack of a tree splitting under ice, or the distant cry of wolves. But otherwise, the world was still. That stillness reminded them of their vulnerability, of the distance from home, and of the uncertainty of survival. The forest that had once promised opportunity now seemed indifferent, even hostile. Religious interpretations filled the void. Ministers preached that the forest silence was a reflection of God's testing hand, stripping away illusions of abundance to reveal the truth of dependence on divine providence. To Puritan minds, the emptiness of the winter woods was both a warning and a lesson. Just as the forest gave nothing freely in winter, so too must men labor in faith to prove themselves. The silence became not only a physical reality, but a spiritual metaphor for the loneliness of the soul without God's grace. Over time, colonists adapted to the rhythm of the silent forest. They learned to hunt with greater skill, to store food, and to read the land with more accuracy. Yet the memory of those first winters never faded. The silence of the forest, once overwhelming, remained in collective memory as a symbol of both vulnerability and endurance. For each log hauled, each trail broken in snow, and each empty hunt, settlers remembered that survival in New England depended not on what the forest gave, but on what they could take, and on the lessons they were willing to learn from those who had thrived there for centuries. As winter deepened across the settlements of early New England, cold and hunger were not the only threats to survival. The cabins that promised safety from frost often became breeding grounds for illness. Crowded, smoky, and damp, these spaces turned into incubators for disease. When food ran low and fires struggled to warm their occupants, immune systems weakened, and ailments that might have been survivable in milder climates became deadly. For settlers who had already endured the shock of the first frost and the silence of the winter forest, the spread of disease brought despair into their very hearts. Illnesses in winter were shaped by conditions settlers could not easily control. Malnutrition from meager diets left bodies vulnerable. A lack of fresh vegetables led to scurvy, its symptoms devastating. Gums bleeding, teeth loosening, joints swelling, and skin bruising easily. William Bradford's A Plymouth Plantation describes a great sickness of 1620 to 1621, when scurvy and other diseases swept to the cramped Mayflower quarters and hastily built cabins. Pneumonia and influenza spread quickly in these same conditions, their fevers and coughing fits intensified by the smoky air that filled poorly ventilated homes. Respiratory diseases were especially common. Early fireplaces belched smoke into rooms, blackening walls and ceilings while irritating lungs. Children and the elderly, already frail from hunger, were the first to succumb. Settlers wrote of nights filled with coughing and wheezing, of mornings when weakened family members could not rise from their straw beds. Infections that today would be manageable, bronchitis, pleurisy, even common colds, often proved fatal in the cold, damp air of colonial cabins. Smallpox and other contagious diseases also struck in cycles, carried across the Atlantic on ships or spread between settlements. Though not unique to winter, these outbreaks devastated already fragile communities. Without immunity, colonists faced high mortality rates. The disease left scars on survivors, both physical and psychological, and intensified fears of God's judgment. In the bitter months, when survival already seemed precarious, the arrival of epidemic disease deepened the sense of living under constant threat. The lack of medical knowledge compounded the crisis. Physicians were rare in early settlements, and remedies were limited to herbal treatments, poultices, and prayers. Colonists relied on European folk medicine, teas brewed from imported herbs, bleeding to balance humors, or ointment applied to swollen joints. But these measures often did little to halt illness. Indigenous peoples had long traditions of healing, using native plants and practices adapted to the environment, but cultural barriers limited the sharing of this knowledge. Over time, settlers learned from indigenous medicine, incorporating remedies such as willow bark for fevers or spruce beer to combat scurvy. Yet in the first winters, such wisdom was scarce. Disease also spread through malnourished and overworked bodies. The cycle was relentless. Hunger weakened settlers, cold drained their energy, and illness exploited their exhaustion. A mother unable to eat enough could not produce sufficient milk for her infant. A father weakened by a fever could not cut wood, leaving the family exposed to further cold. As sickness spread, households collapsed into crisis, with the death of one member often triggering a spiral that consumed others. Psychologically, disease was as devastating as hunger or frost. The sound of constant coughing, the sight of neighbors carried to graves, and the smell of illness in cramped cabins weighed heavily on survivors. Ministers preached that such suffering was a test of faith, yet many questioned whether they had been forsaken. Diaries captured the despair of families who buried child after child, spouse after spouse, until only a handful remained. In some settlements, mortality rates reached catastrophic levels. At Plymouth, of the 102 passengers who had arrived on the Mayflower, only about half survived the first winter. At Jamestown, the starving time, combined with disease, killed hundreds. Burials in winter were grim affairs. The frozen ground resisted shovels, forcing colonists to dig shallow graves or hide the number of dead to prevent indigenous neighbors from perceiving their weakness. Disease robbed settlements not only of lives but morale, leaving survivors haunted by the memory of how quickly illness could strip away entire households. Indigenous peoples also faced the scourge of disease, particularly smallpox, which Europeans carried with them. These epidemics devastated native populations across New England, sometimes killing entire villages. For settlers, indigenous mortality was interpreted as providence, a sign that God had cleared the land for their use. Yet the human cost was staggering, reshaping the demographic and cultural landscape of the region. Disease, in this way, was both an intimate threat inside cabins and a vast force reshaping the history of the continent. Despite the devastation, lessons emerged. Survivors learned the importance of fresh food, adopting indigenous practices of preserving berries, brewing spruce beer, and using native plants to prevent scurvy. They built sturdier cabins with better chimneys, improving ventilation. They established rules for quarantining the sick, though not always effectively. Over time, these adaptations reduced mortality, but the scars of the early winters remained. For those who lived through them, disease was not an abstract danger but a lived reality, the invisible killer that moved silently through the frost. By spring, when warmer air allowed illness to ease, survivors emerged carrying both relief and grief. The cabins that seemed protected were now remembered as tombs for the sick. The memory of coughing nights and silent mornings, of shallow graves hidden in snow, remained etched into colonial memory. Disease and the frost had taught them that survival was not only about firewood or food, but about the unseen threats that thrived in the cold, waiting for weakness. For the settlers of early New England, winter was not only a battle against the elements, but also a spiritual trial. The cold, the hunger, and the silence of forests pressed heavily on body and soul alike. In a world where every hardship was interpreted through the lens of faith, the frozen wilderness became more than a physical environment. It was a crucible in which belief was tested, refined, or, in some cases, broken. For Puritans and Pilgrims alike, survival was inseparable from their understanding of God's will. Religion was at the heart of colonial life, and the long winters only reinforced its role. Ministers preached that suffering was part of God's providence, intended to strengthen the faithful and purge them of sin. Sermons delivered during the depths of winter framed the cold as both punishment and opportunity. Punishment for the sins of humanity, but also an opportunity to demonstrate obedience and trust in divine mercy. In this way, every frostbitten hand, every empty stomach, and every grave dug in frozen ground was given meaning within a larger spiritual narrative. Fasting and prayer were central responses to winter hardship. When supplies dwindled or disease spread, communities called for days of fasting, humbling themselves before God in hopes of relief. Families gathered around smoky hearths to recite scripture, seeking comfort in biblical passages that describe trials in barren deserts or through stormy seas. Ministers compared their flocks to the Israelites wandering in the wilderness, tested by scarcity and sustained only by faith. For settlers cut off by snowstorms and trapped in small cabins, such parallels provided a sense of purpose to otherwise overwhelming suffering. The cold also shaped worship itself. Churches, often little more than wooden meeting houses, were as frigid as the cabins. Accounts describe congregations gathering for hours-long sermons while snow drifted through cracks in the walls. Worshippers stamped their feet to keep warm, huddled under cloaks, and endured frostbitten fingers while clutching Bibles. Yet attendance remained high, for to miss church in winter was not simply forgo community. It was to risk spiritual neglect in a time of trial. In their eyes, the very act of braving the cold to worship was itself a form of devotion. Faith provided more than explanation. It offered psychological resilience. For those who buried children or spouses during winter, religion gave words to grief. Ministers reminded the bereaved that the dead were safe in the Lord's keeping, their suffering ended, their souls secure. Such words did not erase sorrow, but they gave structure to mourning. Without this framework, despair might have overwhelmed survivors. In this sense, faith was as vital as firewood, not a shield against frost, but a means of enduring its toll. Religion also informed practical decisions. Communities debated whether hunger or sickness signaled divine displeasure or natural misfortune. These discussions shaped whether to seek help from indigenous neighbors, whether to ration food differently, or whether to risk travel in search of supplies. Some settlers viewed aid from native peoples as providential, evidence that God had placed resources in their path. Others saw dependence on outsiders as a sign of weakness or temptation. These debates reveal how intertwined faith was with the daily realities of survival. The frozen wilderness also heightened the sense of spiritual isolation. Surrounded by snow and silence, settlers felt cut off not only from England, but sometimes from God himself. Ministers recorded periods of doubt among their congregations, when long winters led individuals to question why suffering was so constant. These crises of faith were often countered by reminders that Job endured trials, that Christ fasted in the desert, and that the elect were refined through hardship. Doubt itself was seen as part of the test, another fire through which the faithful were purified. The contrast with indigenous spirituality was striking. Native peoples of New England did not interpret winter as divine punishment, but as part of the natural cycle. Their rituals and beliefs emphasize harmony with the seasons, preparation, and respect for the forces of nature. For settlers, this worldview was alien, sometimes even threatening, yet it was also instructive. Some colonists observed that indigenous resilience in winter came not from constant prayer, but from centuries of adaptation and practical knowledge. Over time, the settlers' reliance on both faith and borrowed survival strategies created a complex balance between belief and pragmatism. Religious symbolism permeated even the smallest acts of winter life. Lighting a fire was compared to kindling the fire of the soul. Gathering was seen as fulfilling divine duty. The first glimpse of spring thaw was interpreted as God's mercy renewed. Ministers wrote sermons tying natural events directly to Scripture, reminding settlers that every moment of survival reflected the hand of providence. The wilderness, no matter how cold, was never just landscape. It was a stage for spiritual testing. By the end of winter, those who survived often credited their endurance not only to supplies or strength but to faith. They told stories of nights when prayer sustained them as much as food, of moments when Scripture gave comfort amid death, and of how communal worship kept despair at bay. For them, the frozen wilderness had been not just endured but sanctified, a place where gods would have been revealed through frost and silence. In this way, winter in New England was more than a season. It was a sermon written in ice and snow, a reminder that faith could be both shield and burden, comfort and challenge. For settlers who sought to build a new world, the frozen wilderness became their first great congregation, where every log burned and every prayer spoken testified to their struggle to endure. As the winters of early New England dragged on, settlers soon discovered that survival often depended not only on faith or family strength, but also on exchange. In a world where coins were scarce and markets unreliable, barter became the currency of desperation. Families traded what little they had, tools, labor, or food, in a fragile web of survival that could determine whether one cabin endured the cold or fell into ruin. European settlers brought with them a tradition of markets and coin-based economies. But in the New World, money often had little meaning. Precious metals were in short supply, and few had enough to matter. Instead, barter defined daily life, especially in winter when scarcity turned every object into potential currency. Firewood, essential for warmth and cooking, was one of the most valuable commodities. Families with access to woodlands could trade logs for food, clothing, or labor. Corn, when available, became another critical item of exchange, measured not in weight but in bushels or pecks, often traded seed for seed. As scarcity deepened in winter, desperation reshaped the terms of trade. A settler might give away a prize tool, an axe or musket, for a sack of grain. Neighbors might pledge future labor, promising weeks of work in exchange for food to last a season. In this way, survival became communal, dependent not only on one's own resources, but on the willingness of others to negotiate. Yet this system was fragile. If a neighbor fell ill, broke a promise, or died, the chain of barter collapsed, leaving families exposed to hunger and cold. Indigenous communities also became part of this exchange system. Native peoples traded furs, corn, beans, and fish for European goods such as iron tools, cloth, and weapons. For settlers, these exchanges were often the difference between life and death in winter. The Wampanoag, Narragansett, and other peoples provided corn during the early years, teaching settlers not only how to grow it, but how to preserve it. In return, colonists offered beads, trinkets, or tools. These transactions, however, were never simple. Power imbalances, cultural misunderstandings, and growing colonial expansion strained relationships. What began as mutual aid gradually shifted into exploitation, particularly as settlers grew in number and pressed into indigenous lands. In times of extreme scarcity, barter gave way to desperate measures. Settlers recorded trading clothing, bedding, or even the last pieces of iron from their cabins in exchange for food. Families stripped roofs of thatch to feed livestock, knowing it left them vulnerable to rain and snow. Parents offered their own labor or that of their children as indentured service to wealthier neighbors in return for food. Such exchanges highlight the brutal choices settlers faced, where survival demanded sacrifice and often reinforced inequalities. The harshness of winter magnified these disparities. Wealthier settlers with more land, livestock, or access to trade fared better and could dictate the terms of barter. Poorer families often paid the higher price. Diaries note resentment among communities, where some accused their neighbors of hoarding or taking advantage of desperation. Ministers warned against greed, reminding congregations that charity was a Christian duty. Yet hunger often overrode morality, and survival trumped generosity. Winter also brought the emergence of black market trade. Colonists near coastal settlements sometimes engaged in clandestine exchanges with fishermen or passing ships, trading lumber or furs for supplies in defiance of official restrictions. While risky, such trade offered access to flour, salt pork, or imported goods that could not be secured locally. For isolated inland communities, however, no such lifeline existed, leaving barter with neighbors or indigenous peoples as the only means of survival. The psychological weight of barter was immense. Every trade was a reminder of scarcity, a negotiation over survival. Families who parted with heirlooms, tools, or land in winter carried the loss long after spring thawed the ground. For some, the shame of dependency was almost as heavy as hunger itself. In Puritan culture, self-reliance was a moral ideal, and needing others in such visible ways was a blow to dignity. Yet, without barter, many would not have lived to see spring. By the late 17th century, colonial governments attempted to stabilize winter trade by issuing paper notes or recognizing certain commodities, such as corn, beaver pelts, or wampum, as legal tender. These measures were unevenly enforced but reflected the central role of barter and exchange in frontier life. Even with these attempts, winter continued to strip communities bare, forcing them into cycles of negotiation and sacrifice. In the end, barter in the frozen months was more than economic exchange. It was a testament to the interconnectedness of survival. Firewood traded for corn traded for labor, labor traded for warmth. Each transaction linked families in a chain that stretched across cabins, villages, and even cultures. Yet these exchanges also sowed tensions that would echo into the future, laying bare the delicate balance between cooperation and exploitation in the crucible of New England's winters. Winter in early New England was not merely a season to endure. It was a season of death. For settlers unprepared for the bitter cold, the snow-covered landscape became both shroud and grave. Families would survive the Atlantic crossing, while the backbreaking labor of summer planting often found themselves defeated by January storms. Hunger, exhaustion, and illness claimed lives silently, while the unyielding frost forced survivors to reckon with the finality of loss in ways both practical and spiritual. The mortality of the first winters remained staggering. At Plymouth in 1620 to 1621, nearly half the passengers of the Mayflower perished before spring. Scurvy, pneumonia, and exposure carried off entire households, and the sight of freshly dug graves became as common as the sight of smoke curling from cabin chimneys. Jamestown's starving time, a decade earlier, had already foreshadowed the grim toll, with settlers resorting to desperate measures, including documented accounts of cannibalism, when winter sealed them off from supplies. These were not isolated tragedies, but recurring patterns in colonial life, stark reminders of the thin line between survival and death. Burial during winter was a grueling ordeal. Frozen ground resisted shovels, and men broke axes and iron bars trying to carve through permafrost. In some cases, graves could only be dug shallow, with snow piled high to conceal the dead, until spring thaw allowed proper burial. Others resorted to secret burials to hide the true extent of mortality, fearful that indigenous neighbors might see their weakness. The burial grounds themselves, often near settlements or atop small rises, became silent markers of the cost of winter, rows of simple wooden markers or unmarked mounds beneath snow. The psychological toll of death in winter was immense. For families huddled in one-room cabins, the presence of a dying relative was unavoidable. Children witnessed parents wasting away, and parents buried infants wrapped in cloth too thin for the cold. Survivors recorded the despair of hearing neighbors' homes fall silent, knowing it meant death had visited again. Ministers urged congregants to see death as part of God's plan, But grief pressed heavily on those who remained. The memory of loss lingered long after spring returned, shaping the character of colonial communities. Winter also magnified inequality in death. The wealthy could sometimes afford sturdier coffins, deeper graves, or preserve food that kept death at bay. The poor, by contrast, were often the first to succumb. In some cases, desperate barter left families without the very tools needed to bury their dead. Ministers preached charity for the widowed and orphaned, yet the burden of survival often left neighbors unable to do more than offer prayers. For indigenous peoples, death in winter carried its own rituals and meanings. Many native communities prepared spiritually for seasonal loss, holding ceremonies that honored those who died during the harsh months. Yet the arrival of Europeans brought new epidemics, devastating populations with smallpox and other diseases. Entire villages were lost during cold seasons when illness combined with scarcity. To the settlers, these deaths were often interpreted as divine providence, evidence that God had cleared the land for their use. For indigenous survivors, however, they represented catastrophic loss, fracturing families and traditions that had endured for centuries. The specter of death also shaped settlement patterns. Communities built closer together, partly for defense but also for mutual aid in times of loss. Shared cemeteries became sacred spaces, binding settlers together in grief. Ministers used funerals as moments of spiritual reflection, turning death into both mourning and sermon. These rituals helped give structure to loss, but they could not soften the harsh reality that every winter meant more graves. By the late 17th century, some of the worst mortality rates had lessened. Better housing, knowledge of local crops, and trade networks reduced the toll. Yet death in winter never disappeared. Even in established towns, outbreaks of influenza or shortages of firewood could still claim dozens of lives in a single season. The memory of earlier winters haunted communities, serving as a warning that complacency was dangerous. Every first frost was a reminder of how fragile survival remained. In the end, death in the snow was as much a part of New England's early history as the harvest or the hearth. For those who endured, survival was defined not only by their own strength, but by the losses they carried forward. The graves left behind beneath the snow told a story as enduring as any sermon or law. That life on the frontier was always lived on the edge of death, and that winter, more than any enemy, was a settler's most relentless adversary. After months of unbroken frost, the first hints of spring arrived like whispers of deliverance. For settlers in early New England, these subtle changes, a drip of water from an icicle, the softening of snow beneath midday sun, or the faint chorus of birds returning to bare trees, were more than natural events. They were signals of survival, evidence that the cycle of suffering was finally bending toward relief. Yet the thaw did not erase hardship overnight. It unfolded slowly, unpredictably, and with dangers of its own. The first sign was often the lengthening of daylight. As February turned to March, the sun lingered longer in the sky, casting weaker shadows over fields still buried in snow. Families noted the change with both relief and impatience, knowing that light did not immediately bring warmth. Settlers' diaries record the peculiar tension of this time, the hope stirred by longer days mixed with the frustration of enduring weeks of mud, ice, and lingering hunger before true spring arrived. Streams and rivers marked another turning point. Frozen waterways, long silent, began to crack and groan as ice gave way to flowing water. The breaking of river ice was both a dramatic spectacle and a practical shift, allowing access to mills and signaling the approach of planting season. Yet floods often followed, as melting snow swelled rivers and washed over lowland farms. For those whose cabins sat near water, the thaw could bring destruction as easily as relief. The thaw also tested the strength of settlements. Roads that had been impassable with snow now dissolved into mud, slowing travel and making transport of supplies difficult. Wagons stuck in ruts, Livestock floundered in deep muck, and settlers sometimes found themselves more isolated in March than in midwinter. For those already weakened by hunger, this transitional season could be the most trying, a final barrier before the land truly renewed itself. Food supplies were at their lowest during the thaw. Winter stores had been consumed, and new crops had yet to be planted. Colonists referred to this as a hungry gap, when meals grew smaller and diets meager. For some, the thaw meant turning again to foraging, gathering early shoots, tapping maple trees for sap, or fishing in newly opened streams. Indigenous peoples had long adapted to the seasonal challenge, relying on deep-rooted knowledge of wild foods and careful planning. Settlers, slower to adapt, often endured weeks of hardship even as the land stirred with new life. The psychological effect of the thaw was profound. After months of gray skies and silence, the sound of flowing water, the scent of damp earth, and the sight of migrating birds lifted spirits. Ministers framed these changes in religious language, preaching that God's mercy had once again triumphed over trial. Families gave thanks not only for surviving winter, but for witnessing its passing. The thaw became a ritual of renewal, shaping the rhythm of colonial life year after year. Yet dangers persisted. Weak bodies, worn down by months of malnutrition and illness, sometimes failed in the final weeks of winter. Diseases like dysentery and typhus often surged in spring, spread by thawing waste and contaminated water. Children in particular were vulnerable, with some communities reporting as many deaths in March and April as in January. The relief of the thaw was thus shadowed by fresh waves of sickness. Agricultural labor resumed as soon as the thaw allowed. Settlers rushed to prepare fields, mend fences, and ready seed for planting. The urgency was born of necessity. Any delay meant less food for the coming year, and memories of winter's hunger remained raw. Communities organized work bees to repair damaged mills and roads, emphasizing cooperation as a foundation of survival. The thaw was not a pause, but a signal that the cycle of toil must begin again. For indigenous peoples, the thaw was equally significant. Seasonal camps shifted, hunting expanded, and fishing intensified as rivers came alive with spawning fish. These practices reflected a deep attunement to the rhythms of the land, honed over generations. Settlers sometimes marveled at this resilience, though they rarely acknowledged the knowledge it represented. Instead, they interpreted the thaw through their own lens, as providence, as deliverance, as the hand of God visible in nature's renewal. By April, green shoots began to emerge from thawing soil, and the psychological burden of winter finally lifted. Families who had buried loved ones during the cold now turned their energy to the living, investing hope in the season ahead. The thaw marked more than survival. It was a promise of continuity, the chance to rebuild what had been lost, and a reminder that even in the harshest climates, life could endure. The signs of thaw, modest though they seemed, were thus among the most powerful events of the colonial year. They embodied both the fragility of human survival and the resilience that allowed communities to persist. For every settler who lived to see the thaw, the sound of melting snow was not just nature's song. It was the anthem of survival. The thaw marked not the end of hardship, but the beginning of labor. For early New England settlers, survival through winter was only half the battle. As soon as the ground softened and rivers cleared, communities turned urgently to the work of rebuilding. Cabins had to be repaired, tools mended, fields prepared, and spirits restored. The memory of the frost still lingered, but the demands of spring allowed little time for mourning. Reflection, though ever present, occurred alongside action. The first task was often to repair shelters. Winter's weight had pressed down on roofs, snow seeping through thatch, ice splitting wooden beams. Cabins, hastily built in the first years of settlement, required constant maintenance. Families patched gaps with clay or daub, replaced broken shingles, and reinforced chimneys weakened by months of constant fire. Some settlers expanded their homes, adding lean-tos or storage rooms in hopes of better weathering the next season. The architecture of New England slowly evolved from crude huts to sturdier houses, reflecting both necessity and adaptation. Agricultural work began almost immediately. The hungry gap of spring, when food stores were at their lowest, left no margin for delay. Fields had to be cleared of stones pushed up by frost, plowed, and planted with corn, beans, and squash. European grains like wheat and barley were also sown, though they often fared poorly in New England's rocky soil. Livestock, thin from winter confinement, were driven into pastures to regain strength. Every action carried urgency. A missed planting could mean hunger again when the next winter returned. Communal labor became essential. Settlers organized bees, collective gatherings where neighbors worked together on tasks too great for one family. They raised barns, repaired mills, and restored bridges washed out by thaw floods. These gatherings reinforced social bonds, balancing the isolation of winter with the solidarity of spring. Ministers often blessed such efforts, framing them as extensions of the covenant community, where survival was not individual but collective. Reflection on the winter, just past, permeated daily life. Survivors measured their endurance not only in supplies consumed but in lives lost. Graveyards told the story of each season. Rows of fresh mounds marked the cost of frost, hunger, and disease. Families who had buried loved ones in shallow, frozen ground now returned to tend graves properly, marking them with wooden crosses or simple stones. Such acts of remembrance ensured that loss was acknowledged even as life pressed forward. Ministers used the season of rebuilding as a time of moral reflection. Sermons emphasized the spiritual lessons of winter, humility in the face of God's power, gratitude for deliverance, and the importance of vigilance. The suffering of the past months was interpreted as both trial and warning, a reminder that prosperity could never be taken for granted. Congregations responded with renewed dedication to fasting, prayer, and communal discipline, determined not to forget the price of neglect or complacency. The thaw also reopened avenues of trade. Roads, though muddy, became passable, and coastal settlements resumed contact with ships bringing supplies. Colonists bartered furs, lumber, or fish for tools, cloth, and salt. For many, these exchanges were opportunities to replace what winter had consumed or destroyed. Trade with indigenous peoples also resumed, though relations remained tense. Corn, fish, and knowledge of the land continued to flow from native communities to settlers, even as land disputes and cultural misunderstandings deepened. Reflection extended beyond physical and spiritual needs to questions of identity. Having survived another winter, settlers increasingly saw themselves as distinct from the England they had left behind. The harshness of New England's climate demanded resilience, and that resilience forged a sense of belonging to the land. The experience of enduring together, of rebuilding after frost, of mourning shared losses, of facing spring with determination, became part of collective colonial identity. The wilderness was no longer just an enemy. It was a shaping force, molding communities into something new. Yet the memory of hardship remained close. Families prepared for the next winter, even as they celebrated the arrival of spring. Firewood was cut early, settlers restocked, and plans made to expand fields or herds. Reflection turned quickly to preparation, for experience had taught settlers that survival depended on foresight. Every act of rebuilding was also an act of defense against the frost come. By late spring, the rhythm of life returned. Children tended livestock, women worked gardens, men repaired fences and tools. The landscape, once frozen and silent, now hummed with activity. Yet beneath the noise of axes and plows lay the memory of silence, the winter's frozen stillness, when death had seemed closer than life. That memory shaped not only the settlers' work, but their worldview, embedding them a deep awareness of nature's power and of human vulnerability. Rebuilding and reflection thus marked more than recovery. They were rituals of renewal, binding survivors to one another and to the land. For every family who patched a cabin, planted a seed, or placed a marker on a grave, the act was more than practical. It was symbolic. It declared that, despite the losses of winter, life continued, and hope, fragile though it was, endured alongside memory. Each winter that settlers endured in New England left behind more than graves and empty granaries. It left lessons etched into memory, passed from parent to child, from pulpit to congregation, and from community to community. These lessons, born from trial and reinforced by necessity, gradually transformed fragile outposts into enduring colonies. Survival depended not only on firewood and food, but on knowledge: what to plant, when to store, how to build, and how to endure. Winter became the sternest teacher, and its lessons defined colonial life. The most immediate lesson was preparation. The first settlers, unfamiliar with the climate, often underestimated the scale of provisions needed for the cold months. Their miscalculations had devastating consequences. After repeated seasons of hunger, survivors learned to overprepare, cutting more wood than seemed necessary, storing more corn than seemed possible, and preserving food in ways they had once neglected. Cellars were dug deeper, granaries built sturdier, and smokehouses filled with salted meat and fish. These practices became part of the annual rhythm, as much a ritual as planting or worship. Architectural lessons also emerged. The crude huts of the earliest winters gave way to sturdier homes with improved insulation and chimneys designed to reduce smoke and retain heat. Settlers experimented with stone foundations, thicker walls, and better roofing materials. They learned to position houses with care, shielding them from prevailing winds or placing them near sources of wood and water. These adjustments reflected both trial and adaptation, shaping the distinct colonial architecture that still defines New England landscapes today. Agriculture, too, was transformed by winter's trials. Colonists learned from indigenous neighbors the value of corn, beans, and squash, crops better suited to New England soil and climate than European grains. They adapted planting schedules, developed methods of crop rotation, and expanded storage techniques. The failure of wheat or barley no longer meant catastrophe, as maize became the cornerstone of survival. The hard lesson of crop failure pushed settlers to diversify their food sources, ensuring that no single harvest determined their fate. Winter also instilled social lessons. Communities discovered that survival was impossible in isolation. Mutual aid, whether through barter, communal labor, or shared worship, proved essential. Barn raisings, wood-cutting bees, and cooperative planting were not simply cultural traditions, but survival strategies forged by winters that punished selfishness and rewarded solidarity. These patterns laid the groundwork for the communal ethos that defined much of early New England society, intertwining necessity with moral duty. Faith, too, carried lessons forward. Ministers interpreted winter's hardships as divine instruction, urging humility, obedience, and vigilance. Congregations were reminded that prosperity could foster complacency, while suffering kept faith sharp. This interpretation ensured that the memory of hardship became moral, as well as practical, shaping sermons and community values for generations. The lessons of winter were thus embedded not only in tools and techniques, but in worldviews and theologies. Relations with indigenous peoples also carried lessons, though often imperfectly applied. Early dependence on native knowledge, from methods of planting to preservation of food, was undeniable. Yet as settlers grew more secure, they often ignored or dismissed the very wisdom that had sustained them. Still, some practices endured, particularly those that directly addressed survival in harsh winters. Spruce beer, learned from indigenous medicine, remained a staple remedy against scurvy. Knowledge of local hunting grounds and fishing practices persisted as well, reminders of a debt that colonists rarely acknowledged openly. Political and legal lessons also emerged. Colonial governments began to regulate grain prices, monitor trade, and encourage stockpiling. Officials recognized that unchecked scarcity could unravel entire communities, leading to desperation and unrest. By enacting measures that stabilized food supplies, they sought to protect settlements from repeating the devastating losses of earlier winters. These policies reflected the maturation of colonies, as survival shifted from individual households to collective governance. Perhaps the most profound lesson was psychological. The settlers learned to expect hardship. Winter was no longer seen as an unpredictable disaster, but as a certainty. Families prepared not only with wood and food, but with the mental endurance needed to face months of confinement, cold, and silence. This stoicism became a defining feature of colonial identity, shaping how New Englanders saw themselves and their place in the world. By the late 17th century, these lessons had transformed life in New England. Winters remained harsh and mortality never disappeared, but the scale of loss lessened. Settlers no longer faced each frost with panic, but with practiced determination. They had adapted, turning experience into resilience, and in doing so ensured that their colonies would endure. The last log on the fire no longer signaled imminent starvation, but a reminder how far they had come from those first desperate winters. Every generation of settlers in New England carried forward memories of the winters that had tested them. These were not abstract tales, but lived experiences retold in family gatherings, sermons, and community records. The long months of hunger, the graves dug in frozen ground, and the relief of spring thaw became part of the region's collective memory. For colonists who prided themselves on endurance, the remembrance of winter was both burden and identity, a constant reminder of how survival had shaped their lives. Stories of the first winters became cornerstones of local history. At Plymouth, the winter of 1620 to 1621 was remembered as the most harrowing season, when nearly half the Mayflower passengers perished. William Bradford's The Plymouth Plantation preserved the memory in stark prose, ensuring that later generations knew the cost of their beginnings. Similar accounts from Jamestown's Starving Time or smaller New England outposts echoed these themes. That winter was not simply a season, but a defining trial. These stories, passed down through generations, carried the weight of cautionary tales, urging vigilance and preparation. Memory was reinforced through ritual. Each year, as winter approached, sermons recalled the hardships of earlier times. Ministers used historical examples to remind congregations of their dependence on God's providence. Families retold stories of ancestors who had survived scurvy, hunger, or isolation, turning personal loss into communal narrative. In this way, the memory of winters past was not confined to written records, but lived on an oral tradition, shaping behavior as effectively as law. Material reminders also carried memory. Cemeteries held rows of graves from winter months, often clustered together, silent markers of frost toll. Wooden markers decayed, but the memory of who lay beneath persisted in family lore. Some homes bore scars from those winters, rebuilt chimneys, reinforced roofs, expanded storage rooms, each improvement a physical response to past suffering. In the landscape itself, memory was inscribed through adaptation. For indigenous peoples, memory of winters past carried different weight. Epidemics introduced by Europeans, often striking hardest during the cold months, decimated entire villages. Oral traditions preserve stories of loss and resilience, recounting how communities adapted, moved, or rebuilt after devastation. These memories serve as warnings and lessons, shaping seasonal practices and reinforcing the need for preparation. To indigenous survivors, winters past were not only about natural cycles, but about the profound disruption brought by colonial contact. Memory also shaped colonial identity beyond survival. The harshness of winter became a source of pride, distinguishing New Englanders from their English kin. To endure long months of frost was to prove strength, discipline, and faith. Settlers contrasted their resilience with the supposed softness of those in milder climates, framing winter hardship as evidence of moral superiority. Over time, this narrative hardened into a regional ethos, binding memory to identity in ways that influenced politics, religion, and culture. Yet, memory was not only celebratory. For many, it was haunted by grief. Families remember the children lost to fever, the parents buried in shallow graves, the nights spent shivering without enough food. These memories lingered in diaries, letters, and oral traditions, sometimes resurfacing in moments of new hardship. The recurrence of loss across generations gave the impression that winter was not merely seasonal but eternal, a recurring adversary that demanded constant vigilance. The memory of winters past also influenced colonial policy. Governments recalled famines and responded with laws designed to prevent repetition. Grain stores were regulated, trade agreements established, and communal granaries encouraged. Leaders cited past failures as justification for stricter oversight, embedding memory into governance itself. The past was not just remembered but institutionalized, ensuring its lessons shaped collective action. As settlements matured and mortality declined, the memory of earlier winters did not fade but grew more mythic. Later generations, insulated by better housing and agriculture, still look back on their ancestors' suffering as the crucible that defined them. In their collective memory, the first winters became symbolic of divine testing, resilience, and providence. Even as practical danger lessened, the cultural memory of frost continued to shape identity, reminding each new generation of the cost of complacency. By the 18th century, winter was no longer the existential threat it had once been, yet the stories endured. They lived in sermons, in graveyards, in family tales, and in the architecture of colonial homes. Winter's memory was not just a suffering but a survival, not only of loss but of endurance. The snow that once buried cabins and fields had melted, but its legacy remained, etched into the very fabric of New England society. The settlers of early New England lived in a world where every winter carried the possibility of ruin. Frost, hunger, disease, and isolation carved deep scars into their lives. Yet from these scars emerged a story of endurance that shaped not only families and villages but the identity of a region. Winter was their fiercest adversary, but in overcoming it, they forged a legacy that outlasted the snow. Endurance was measured first in survival. To live through a New England winter meant enduring months of hunger, tending fires through long nights, and guarding supplies with vigilance. Families who emerged from the frost with life intact saw themselves as strengthened, their survival proof of resilience and providence. Communities that endured together bound themselves tighter, their shared suffering reinforcing trust, cooperation, and belief in divine guidance. Winter was not only a season but a crucible, a trial that tested the body, the spirit, and the collective will. This endurance left behind legacies both tangible and intangible. Architecturally, the lessons of frost reshaped the built environment. Sturdier homes, deeper cellars, and meeting houses that doubled as sanctuaries against the cold. Agriculturally, maize, beans, and squash became staples, blending indigenous knowledge with European practices to create a hybrid system uniquely adapted to New England. Socially, winters forged habits of mutual aid, barn raisings, communal fasting, and neighborhood woodcutting, traditions that outlived the immediate crisis of frost and became cultural hallmarks. Spiritually, winter hardship reinforced the Puritan and Pilgrim belief that suffering was purposeful, that trial revealed God's hand in history. Ministers framed endurance as evidence of election, shaping the religious self-perception of entire communities. The very memory of surviving famine and frost became part of theological narrative, one that portrayed New Englanders as a chosen people, hardened and purified by adversity. The legacy of these winters extended far beyond the 17th century. Later generations look back on the first settlers' struggles as origin stories, weaving hardship into myths of identity. The graves, diaries, and sermons of the early winters became symbols of courage, often retold in ways that elevated resilience while softening the memory of despair. By the time of the American Revolution, these narratives of endurance against winter hardship had helped cultivate an image of New Englanders as tough, self-reliant, and morally steadfast, an identity that would echo through the centuries. Yet endurance was not without cost. The graves of thousands testified to the fragility of human life in the face of frost, the devastation of indigenous populations, accelerated by disease and disrupted by colonial expansion, revealed that survival for one people often came at the expense of another. Winter was a teacher, but its lessons were written in sacrifice, loss, and transformation. The true legacy of these winters lies in their dual nature. They revealed human vulnerability and human adaptability, despair and resilience, isolation and community. Every thaw was a renewal, but every frost a reminder of limits. Settlers learned that survival required preparation, cooperation, and faith, lessons that carried into the cultural DNA of New England. Today, when winter arrives with modern comforts of heat and abundance, it is difficult to imagine the desperation of those early nights when a last log on a fire might mean the difference between life and death. Yet their story endures, not as distant tragedy, but as testament to the resilience of the human spirit. The legacy of New England's first winters is not merely about survival. It is about how suffering shaped identity, how endurance became heritage, and how the memory of frost carved its place into history. After months of unbroken frost, the first hints of spring arrived like whispers of deliverance. For settlers in early New England, these subtle changes, a drip of water from an icicle, the softening of snow beneath midday sun, or the faint chorus of birds returning to bare trees, were more than natural events. They were signals of survival, evidence that the cycle of suffering was finally bending toward relief. Yet the thaw did not erase hardship overnight. It unfolded slowly, unpredictably, and with dangers of its own. The first sign was often the lengthening of daylight. As February turned to March, the sun lingered longer in the sky, casting weaker shadows over fields still buried in snow. Families noted the change with both relief and impatience, knowing that light did not immediately bring warmth. Settlers' diaries record the peculiar tension of this time, the hope stirred by longer days mixed with the frustration of enduring weeks of mud, ice, and lingering hunger before true spring arrived. Streams and rivers marked another turning point. Frozen waterways, long silent, began to crack and groan as ice gave way to flowing water. The breaking of river ice was both a dramatic spectacle and a practical shift, allowing access to mills and signaling the approach of planting season. Yet floods often followed, as melting snow swelled rivers and washed over lowland farms. For those whose cabins sat near water, the thaw could bring destruction as easily as relief. The thaw also tested the strength of settlements. Roads that had been impassable with snow now dissolved into mud, slowing travel and making transport of supplies difficult. Wagons stuck in ruts, livestock floundered in deep muck, and settlers sometimes found themselves more isolated in March than in midwinter. For those already weakened by hunger, this transitional season could be the most trying, a final barrier before the land truly renewed itself. Food supplies were at their lowest during the thaw. Winter stores had been consumed, and new crops had yet to be planted. Colonists referred to this as a hungry gap, when meals grew smaller and diets meager. For some, the thaw meant turning again to foraging, gathering early shoots, tapping maple trees for sap, or fishing in newly opened streams. Indigenous peoples had long adapted to the seasonal challenge, relying on deep-rooted knowledge of wild foods and careful planning. Settlers, slower to adapt, often endured weeks of hardship even as the land stirred with new life. The psychological effect of the thaw was profound. After months of gray skies and silence, the sound of flowing water, the scent of damp earth, and the sight of migrating birds lifted spirits. Ministers framed these changes in religious language, preaching that God's mercy had once again triumphed over trial. Families gave thanks not only for surviving winter, but for witnessing its passing. The thaw became a ritual of renewal, shaping the rhythm of colonial life year after year. Yet dangers persisted. Weak bodies, worn down by months of malnutrition and illness, sometimes failed in the final weeks of winter. Diseases like dysentery and typhus often surge in spring, spread by thawing waste and contaminated water. Children in particular were vulnerable, with some communities reporting as many deaths in March and April as in January. The relief of the thaw was thus shadowed by fresh waves of sickness. Agricultural labor resumed as soon as the thaw allowed. Settlers rushed to prepare fields, mend fences, and ready seed for planting. The urgency was born of necessity. Any delay meant less food for the coming year, and memories of winter's hunger remained raw. Communities organized work bees to repair damaged mills and roads, emphasizing cooperation as a foundation of survival. The thaw was not a pause, but a signal that the cycle of toil must begin again. For indigenous peoples, the thaw was equally significant. Seasonal camps shifted, hunting expanded, and fishing intensified as rivers came alive with spawning fish. These practices reflected a deep attunement to the rhythms of the land, honed over generations. Settlers sometimes marveled at this resilience, though they rarely acknowledged the knowledge it represented. Instead, they interpreted the thaw through their own lens, as providence, as deliverance, as the hand of God visible in nature's renewal. By April, green shoots began to emerge from thawing soil, and the psychological burden of winter finally lifted. Families who had buried loved ones during the cold now turned their energy to the living, investing hope in the season ahead. The thaw marked more than survival. It was a promise of continuity, the chance to rebuild what had been lost, and a reminder that even in the harshest climates, life could endure. The signs of thaw, modest though they seemed, were thus among the most powerful events of the colonial year. They embodied both the fragility of human survival and the resilience that allowed communities to persist. For every settler who lived to see the thaw, the sound of melting snow was not just nature's song. It was the anthem of survival,